The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 7, Side 2. Among the residence halls at Paris were two designed for student members or novices of the Dominican or the Franciscan order. The Dominicans had from their inception stressed education as a means of combating heresy. They established their own system of schools, of which the Dominican Studium Generale at Cologne was the most renowned. And they had similar institutions at Bologna and Oxford. Many friars became masters and taught in the halls of their orders. In 1232, Alexander of Hales, one of the ablest teachers in Paris, joined the Franciscans and continued his public courses in their convent of the Cordeliers. Year by year, the number of friars lecturing at Paris increased, and their non-monastic audiences grew. The secular masters mourned that they were left sitting at their desks like lonely sparrows on the housetops, to which the friars replied that the secular masters ate and drank too much and became lazy and dull. In 1253, a student was killed in a street brawl. The city authorities arrested several students and ignored their right and demand to be tried by the university masters or the bishop. The masters, in protest, ordered a cessation of lectures. 2 Dominican teachers and 1 Franciscan, all members of the Masters Association, refused to obey the order to cease talk. The association suspended them from membership. They appealed to Alexander IV, who in 1255 ordered the University of Masters to readmit them. To avoid compliance, the masters disbanded. The Pope excommunicated them. Students and populace attacked the friars in the streets. After 6 years of controversy, a compromise was reached. The reorganized masters admitted the monastic masters, who pledged full obedience to university statutes thereafter, but the Faculty of Arts permanently excluded all monks from membership. The University of Paris, once a favorite of the popes, became hostile to the papacy, supported the kings against the pontiffs, and formed in later years the center of the Gallican movement that sought to separate the French Church from Rome. No educational institution since Aristotle has rivaled the influence of the University of Paris. For 3 centuries it drew to itself not only the largest number of students, but the greatest dynasty of intellectually distinguished men. Abelard, John of Salisbury, Albertus Magnus, Sige of Brabant, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventura, Roger Bacon, Duns Scotus, William of Ockham. These are almost the history of philosophy from 1100 to 1400. There must have been great teachers at Paris to produce these greater ones, and an atmosphere of mental exhilaration that comes only to the peaks of human history. Furthermore, through those centuries, the University of Paris was a power in both church and state. It was an influential organ of opinion. In the 14th century, a hotbed of free speculation. In the 15th, a citadel of orthodoxy and conservatism. It cannot be said to have played no mean role in the condemnation of Joan of Arc. Other universities shared in giving France the cultural leadership of Europe. Orléans had a school of law as far back as the 9th century. In the 12th, it rivaled Chartres as a center of classical and literary studies. In the 13th, it was second only to Bologna in the teaching of civil and canon law. Hardly less famous was the School of Law at Angers, which in 1432 became one of the major universities of France. Toulouse owed its university to its heresies. In 1229, Gregory IX compelled Count Raymond to pledge himself to pay the salaries of 14 professors in theology, canon law, and the arts, who should be sent from Paris to Toulouse to combat the Albigensian heresy by their influence on Aquitanian youth. The most renowned of the French universities outside of Paris was at Montpellier. Situated on the Mediterranean, halfway between Marseille and Spain, that city enjoyed a stirring mixture of French, Greek, Spanish, and Jewish blood and culture, with a sprinkling of Italian merchants and some remnants of the Moorish colony that had once held the town. Commerce was active there. Whether through the influence of Salernian or Arabic or Jewish medicine, Montpellier, at an unknown date, established a school of medicine that soon outshone Salerno. Schools of law, theology, and the arts were added, and though these colleges were independent, their propinquity and cooperation earned for Montpellier a high repute. The university declined in the 14th century, but the School of Medicine revived in the Renaissance. And in 1537 one François Rabelais gave there, in Greek, a course of lectures on Hippocrates. 7. Universities of England. Oxford, like the equivalently named Bosporus, developed as a cattle crossing. The Thames narrowed and grew shallow at that point. A fortress was built there in 912, a market formed, and Kings Canute and Harold held gamotes there long before the university arose. Presumably there were schools at Oxford in Canute's days, but we hear of no cathedral school. About 1117 we find mention of a master at Oxenford. In 1133 Robert Pullen, a theologian, came from Paris and lectured at Oxford on theology. By steps now lost to history, the schools of Oxford became in the 12th century a studium generale, or university. No man can say when. In 1209, according to a contemporary estimate, there were 3,000 students and teachers at Oxford. As at Paris, there were 4 faculties: arts, theology, medicine, and canon law. In England, the teaching of civil law escaped the universities and lodged at the Inns of Court in London. Lincoln's Inn, Gray's Inn, the Inner, and the Middle Temple were the 14th-century descendants of the homes or chambers in which judges and teachers of the law in the 12th and 13th centuries received students as apprentices. At Oxford, as at Paris and Cambridge, the colleges began as endowed residence halls for poor students. At an early date, they became also lecture halls. Masters dwelt in them with the students, and by the end of the 13th century the aulae, or halls, had become the physical and pedagogical constituents of the university. About 1260, Sir John de Balliol of Scotland, father of the Scotch king of 1292, as penance for an unknown crime, established at Oxford a House of Balliol, to maintain by a grant of 8 pence, or $8 a week, certain poor scholars called socii, or fellows. 3 years later, Walter de Merton founded and endowed the House of the Scholars of Merton, first at Malden, soon at Oxford, to care for as many students as its income could support. These revenues were repeatedly doubled by the rise of land values, so that Archbishop Peckham in 1284 complained that the poor scholars were receiving additional allowances for delicate living. In general, the English colleges grew wealthy not only by fellowship grants and other gifts, but through the rise in the value of the estates with which they were endowed. About 1280, a bequest of William of Durham, Archbishop of Rouen, established University Hall, now University College. The modest beginnings of these famous colleges is shown in the terms of foundation, which provided for 4 masters and such scholars as might care to board with them. The masters chose one of their number as senior fellow to manage the hall. In time, he or his successors appropriated those titles of master or principal by which the heads of the English colleges are known today. The University of Oxford in the 13th century was an association of these colleges under a university or guild of masters, themselves governed by regents and a chancellor of their own choosing, who in turn was subject to the Bishop of Lincoln and the king. By 1300, Oxford ranked next to Paris as a center of intellectual activity and influence. Its most famous graduate was Roger Bacon. Other Franciscan monks, including Adam Marsh, Thomas of York, John Peckham, formed with him there a distinguished group of learned men. Their leader and inspiration, Robert Grosseteste, possibly from 1175 to 1253, was the finest figure in the life of Oxford in the 13th century. He studied law, medicine, and natural science there, graduated in 1179, took his divinity degree in 1189, and soon afterward was chosen Master of the Oxford Schools, the earlier form of the title of Chancellor. In 1235, while still remaining head of Oxford, he became Bishop of Lincoln and superintended the completion of the great cathedral. He energetically promoted the study of Greek and of Aristotle, and shared in the heroic effort of the 13th century mind to reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with the Christian faith. He wrote commentaries on Aristotle's physics and posterior analytics, summarized the science of his time in a Compendium Scientiarum, and worked for a reform of the calendar. He understood the principles of the microscope and the telescope, and opened many paths for Roger Bacon in mathematics and physics. It was probably he who acquainted Bacon with the magnifying property of the lens. Many ideas that we ascribe to Bacon, on perspective, the rainbow, tides, the calendar, the desirability of experiment, were apparently suggested to him by Grosseteste. Above all, the notion that all science must be based upon mathematics, since all force, in its passage through space, follows geometrical forms and rules. He wrote French poetry and a treatise on husbandry, and was a lawyer and a physician as well as a theologian and a scientist. He encouraged the study of Hebrew with a view to converting the Jews. Meanwhile, he behaved toward them in an anomalously Christian way and protected them as well as he could from the sadism of the mob. He was an active social reformer, always loyal to the Church, but daring to lay before Pope Innocent IV in 1250 a written memorial in which he ascribed the shortcomings of the Church to the practices of the papal curia. At Oxford he established the first chest to make gratuitous loans to scholars. He was the first of 1,000 brilliant minds whose achievements created the magnificent prestige of Oxford in the educational and intellectual world. Today Oxford is a manufacturing center as well as a university and makes automobiles as well as dons. But Cambridge is still a city of colleges, a medieval jewel brightened with modern wealth and British good taste. Everything in it pertains to its colleges, and the medieval peace of mind survives in this loveliest of university towns. Apparently its intellectual eminence must be dated from a murder at Oxford. In 1209 a woman was killed there by a student. The townspeople raided a residence hall and hanged 2 or 3 students. The university, that is, the Association of Masters, suspended operations in protest against the action of the townsfolk, and if we may believe the usually trustworthy Matthew Paris, 3,000 students and presumably many masters left Oxford. A large number of them, we are told, went to Cambridge and set up halls and faculties. This is the first mention we have of anything higher there than an elementary school. A second migration of Parisian students in 1228 swelled the ranks of the student body. Monks, mendicant or Benedictine, came and established colleges. In 1281, the Bishop of Ely organized the first secular college in Cambridge, St. Peter's College, now Peterhouse. The 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries saw the foundation and embellishment of additional colleges, some of them among the masterpieces of medieval architecture. All of them together, embraced by the quiet winding Cam, constitute with their campuses one of the fairest works of man. 8. Student life. The medieval student might be of any age. He might be a curate, a prior, an abbot, a merchant, a married man. He might be a lad of 13, troubled with the sudden dignity of his years. He went to Bologna, Orléans, or Montpellier to become a lawyer or a physician. To other universities he went in some cases to prepare for governmental service, usually to make a career in the church. He encountered no entrance examinations. The only requirements were a knowledge of Latin and ability to pay a modest fee to each master whose course he took. If he was poor, he might be helped by a scholarship, or by his village, his friends, his church, or his bishop. There were thousands of such cases. Abbot Sampson, hero of Josselin's Chronicle and Carlyle's Past and Present, owed his education to a poor priest who sold holy water to keep Sampson in fees. A student traveling to or from a university usually received free transportation and free food and lodging at monasteries on the way. Arriving at Oxford, Paris, or Bologna, he would find himself one of a large crowd of happy, embarrassed, and eager students riding on a wave of intellectual enthusiasm that made philosophy, with a dash of heresy, as exciting as war, and a debate as fascinating as a tournament. At Paris he would have found in 1300 some 7,000 students, at Bologna 6,000, at Oxford 3,000. In general, the universities of Paris, Oxford, and Bologna had more students in the 13th century than later, probably because they had less competition. The newcomer would be received by his nation and might be guided into living quarters, perhaps with some poor family. If he had the right connections, he might get a bed and share a room in one of the hospitia, or residence halls, where his expenses would be light. In 1374, a student at Oxford paid 104 shillings, or $1,040 a year for bed and board, 20 shillings, or $200 for tuition, 40 for clothes. No specific academic dress was enjoined upon him. However, he was requested to button his robe and not go shoeless unless his robe reached to his heels. For distinction, masters wore a capa, a red or purple cope with miniver border and hood. Sometimes they covered the head with a square biretta, topped with a tuft instead of a tassel. The student at Paris had the status and ecclesiastical immunities of a cleric. He was exempt from military service, state taxation, or secular trial. He was expected, not always compelled, to take the tonsure. If he married, he could continue as a student, but he lost his clerical privileges and could not take a degree. A judicious promiscuity, however, involved no such penalties. The monk Jacques de Vitry, about 1230, described the Parisian students as more dissolute than the people. They counted fornication no sin. Prostitutes dragged passing clerics to brothels almost by force, and openly through the streets. If the clerics refused to enter, the whores called them sodomites. That abominable vice, sodomy, so filled the city that it was held a sign of honor if a man kept one or more concubines. In one and the same house there were classrooms above and a brothel beneath. Upstairs masters lectured, downstairs courtesans carried on their base services. In the same house the debates of philosophers could be heard with the quarrels of courtesans and pimps. This has all the earmarks of righteous exaggeration. We may only conclude that at Paris, cleric and saint were not synonyms. Jacques goes on to tell how each national group among the students had favorite adjectives for the other groups. The English were heavy drinkers and had tails. The French were proud and effeminate. The Germans were furibundi, or blusterers, and obscene in their cups. The Flemish were fat and greedy and soft as butter, and all of them, through such backbiting, often passed from words to blows. At Paris, the students were crowded at first into the island holding Notre Dame. This was the original Latin quarter, so called because the students were required to speak Latin even in non-scholastic converse, a rule often breached. Even when the Quartier Latin was extended to include the west end of the suburb south of the Seine, the students were too numerous to be easily policed. Altercations were frequent between student and student master, student and townsman, secular and monk. At Oxford, the bell of St. Mary's summoned the students, and the bell of St. Martin's called the burghers to do battle in an intermittent war between gown and town. One riot in Oxford in 1298 cost £3,000, or $150,000, in damage to property. A Paris official in 1269 issued a proclamation against scholars who, by day and night, atrociously wound and slay many, carry off women, ravish virgins, break into houses, and commit over and over again robberies and many other enormities. Oxford boys may have been less given to lechery than the pupils of Paris, but homicides were frequent there, and executions were rare. If the murderer left town, he was seldom pursued, and an Oxford man considered it sufficient punishment for an Oxford murderer to be compelled to go to Cambridge. As water was hardly safe to drink, and neither tea nor coffee nor tobacco had yet reached Europe, the students reconciled themselves with wine and beer to Aristotle and heatless rooms. One of the main reasons for organizing a university of students was to celebrate religious or academic festivals with conspicuously virile drinking. Every step in the scholastic year was a jocund advent to be graced with wine. Students, in many cases, provided such refreshments for their examiners, and the nations usually consumed in the taverns whatever remained in their treasuries at the end of the scholastic year. Dicing was an added solace. Some students earned excommunication by playing dice on the altars of Notre Dame. In their more orderly moments, the students amused themselves with dogs, hawks, music, dancing, chess, telling stories, and hazing newcomers. Such fledglings were styled bajonies, yellow bills. They were bullied and hoaxed, and were made to provide a feast for their lords of a year's advantage. Discipline relied largely on rules established by each hall of residence. Violations were punished with fines or by sconces, whereby an offending student was mulcted in gallons of wine to be corporately consumed. Flogging, though frequent in grammar schools, is not mentioned in university discipline till the 15th century. For the rest, the university authorities required every student at the beginning of each year to take a solemn oath to obey all regulations. Among the required oaths at Paris was one pledging the student not to take vengeance on examiners who failed to pass him. The students swore in haste and sinned at leisure. Perjury was prevalent. Hell had no terrors for young theologians. Nevertheless, the students found time for lectures. There were sluggards among them. Some who preferred leisure to fame favored the courses in canon law, whose sessions began at the 3rd hour and allowed them to complete their sleep. As the 3rd hour was 9 a.m., it is apparent that most classes met soon after dawn, probably at 7. At the beginning of the 13th century, the school season lasted 11 months. By the end of the 14th century, the long vacation, originating in the need for youthful hands at harvest time, ran from June 28th to August 25th or September 15th. At Oxford and Paris, only a few days were left free at Christmas and Easter. At Bologna, whose students were of greater age and means and perhaps more distant provenance, 10 days were allowed at Christmas, 14 at Easter, 21 for the carnival preceding Lent. There were seemingly no examinations during the scholastic course. There were recitations and disputations, and incompetent students might be weeded out en route. Toward the middle of the 13th century, the custom arose of requiring the student, after 5 years of resident study, to pass a preliminary examination by a committee of his nation. This involved first a private test, a responsio to questions. Second, a public disputation in which the candidate defended one or more theses against challengers, and concluded with a summation of the results, determinatio. Those who passed these preliminary trials were called baccalarii, or bachelors, and were allowed to serve a master as assistant teacher or cursory lecturer. The bachelor might continue his resident studies for 3 years more. Then, if his master thought him fit for the ordeal, he was presented to examiners appointed by the chancellor. Masters were expected not to present clearly unprepared candidates unless they were rich in money or dignity. In such cases, the public examination was adjusted to the candidate's capacity, or it might be dispensed with altogether. Qualities of character were included as subjects for examination. Moral offenses committed during his 4 or 7 years at the university might then block the candidate's access to a degree, for the degree attested moral fitness as well as intellectual preparation. Of 17 failures at the examination of 43 candidates in Vienna in 1449, all were for moral, none for intellectual deficiency. If the student passed this public and final examination, he became a master or doctor and automatically received an ecclesiastically sanctioned license to teach anywhere in Christendom. As a bachelor, he had taught with uncovered head. Now he was crowned with a biretta, received a kiss and a blessing from his master, and, seated in the magisterial chair, gave an inaugural lecture or held an inaugural disputation. This was his inceptio, called at Cambridge his commencement as a master. It was essential to such graduation that he should entertain all or a large number of the masters of the university at a banquet and make presents to them. By these and other ceremonies he was received into the magisterial guild. It is comforting to observe that medieval education had defects as troublesome as the educational systems of today. Only a small proportion of matriculants survived the 5 years required for the baccalaureate. The assumption of all the defined doctrines of the Church as binding on belief put the mind to rest instead of to work. The search for arguments to prove these beliefs, the citing of scriptural or patristic support for them, the interpretation of Aristotle to harmonize with them, trained intellectual subtlety rather than intellectual conscience. We may forgive these faults more readily if we consider that any way of life develops a similar dogmatism about the assumptions on which it rests. So today we leave men free to question the religious but not the political faith of their fathers. The political heresy is punished by social ostracism as theological heresy was punished by excommunication in the age of faith. Now that the policeman labors to take the place of God, it becomes more dangerous to question the state than to doubt the Church. No system smiles upon the challenging of its axioms. The transmission of knowledge and the training of appreciation are obviously more widespread and seem more abundant than in the Middle Ages, but we should not readily say the same for the education of character. Practical ability was not lacking in the medieval graduate. The universities sent forth a considerable number of able administrators, lawyers who made the French monarchy, philosophers who led Christianity out upon the high seas of reason, popes who dared to think in European terms. The universities sharpened the intellect of Western man, created a language for philosophy, made learning respectable, and ended the mental adolescence of the triumphant barbarians. While so many other achievements of the Middle Ages crumble before the juggernaut of time, the universities, bequeathed to us by the age of faith in all the elements of their organization, adjust themselves to inescapable change, molt their old skins to live new lives, and wait for us to wed them to government. Chapter 35. Abelard, 1079 to 1142. 1. Divine Philosophy. Let us give a separate chapter to Abelard, not merely as a philosopher, nor as one of the creators of the University of Paris, nor as a flame that set the mind of Latin Europe afire in the 12th century, but as, with Heloise, part and personification of the morals and literature and highest fascination of their time. He was born in Brittany, near Nantes, in the village of Le Palais. His father, known to us only as Béranger, was the seigneur of a modest estate, and could afford to give his 3 sons and 1 daughter a liberal education. Pierre, we do not know the origin of his surname Abelard, was the oldest and could claim the rights of primogeniture. But he felt so lively an interest in studies and ideas that, on growing up, he surrendered to his brothers his claim and share in the family property, and set out to woo philosophy wherever a philosophic battle raged, or some famous teacher taught. It meant much for his career that one of his first masters was Jean Rosselin, circa 1050 to circa 1120, a rebel who prefigured Abelard by drawing down upon his head the condemnation of the Church. The controversy that Rosselin had aroused stemmed from what seemed the most harmless problem of the driest logic, the objective existence of universals. In Greek and medieval philosophy, a universal was a general idea denoting a class of objects, book, stone, planet, man, mankind, the French people, the Catholic Church, actions, cruelty, justice, or qualities, beauty, truth. Plato, seeing the transitoriness of individual organisms and things, had suggested that the universal is more lasting, therefore more real than any member of the class it describes. Beauty more real than Phryne, justice more real than Aristides, man more real than Socrates. This is what the Middle Ages meant by realism. Aristotle had countered that the universal is merely an idea formed by the mind to represent a class of like objects. The class itself exists, he thought, only as its constituent members. In our time, men have debated whether there is a group mind apart from the desires, ideas, and feelings of the individuals composing the group. And Hume argued that the individual mind itself is only an abstract name for the series and collection of sensations, ideas, and volitions in an organism. The Greeks did not take the problem too much to heart, and one of the last pagan philosophers, Porphyry, circa 232 to circa 304, of Syria and Rome, merely phrased it without offering a solution. But to the Middle Ages the question was vital. The Church claimed to be a spiritual entity additional to the sum of her individual adherents. The whole, she felt, had qualities and powers beyond those of its parts. She could not admit that she was an abstraction, and that the endless ideas and relations suggested by the term the Church were nothing but ideas and feelings in her constituent members. She was the living bride of Christ. Worse yet, if only individual persons, things, actions, and ideas existed, what became of the Trinity? Was the unity of the 3 persons a mere abstraction? Were they 3 separate gods? We must place ourselves in his theological environment to understand the fate of Rosselin. We know his views only through the reports of his opponents. We are told that he considered universals or general ideas to be mere words, voces, mere winds of the voice, flatus vocis. Individual objects and persons exist, all else is names, nomina. Genera and species and qualities have no independent existence. Man does not exist, only men. Color exists only in the form of colored things. The Church would doubtless have let Rosselin alone had he not applied this nominalism to the Trinity. God, he is reported to have said, is a word applied to the 3 persons of the Trinity, just as man is applied to many men. But all that really exists is the 3 persons, in effect 3 gods. This was to admit the polytheism of which Islam implicitly accused Christianity 5 times a day from 1,000 minarets. The Church could not allow such teaching in one who was a canon of the cathedral at Compiègne. Rosselin was summoned before an episcopal synod at Soissons in 1092, and was given a choice between retraction and excommunication. He retracted. He fled to England, attacked clerical concubinage there, returned to France, and taught at Tours and Loches. It was probably at Loches that Abelard sat impatiently at his feet. Abelard rejected nominalism, but it was for doubts about the Trinity that he was twice condemned. It deserves also to be noted that the 12th century called realism the ancient doctrine and gave to its opponents the name of moderni, moderns. The Church was ably defended by Anselm, 1033 to 1109, in several works that seem to have deeply moved Abelard, if only to opposition. Anselm came of a patrician family in Italy. He was made abbot of Bec in Normandy in 1078. Under his rule, as under that of Lanfranc, Bec became one of the major schools of learning in the West. As perhaps ideally described by his fellow monk Eadmer in a loving biography, Anselm was a gentle ascetic who wished only to meditate and pray, and reluctantly emerged from his cell to govern the monastery and its school. To such a man, whose faith was his life, doubt was impossible. Faith must come long before understanding, and how could any finite mind expect ever to understand God? "I do not seek to understand in order to believe," he said, following Augustine. "I believe in order to understand." But his pupils asked for arguments for use against infidels. He himself considered it negligent if, after we are confirmed in our faith, we should not aim to understand what we have believed. He accepted the motto fides quaerens intellectum, faith in quest of understanding, and in a series of immensely influential works he inaugurated scholastic philosophy by attempting a rational defense of the Christian faith. In a little treatise, Monologion, he argued for the objective existence of universals. Our notions of goodness, justice, and truth are relative, and have meaning only by comparison with some absolute goodness, justice, and truth. Unless this absolute exists, we have no certain standards of judgment, and our science and our morality alike are baseless and void. God, objective goodness, justice, and truth, is this saving absolute, the necessary assumption of our lives. As if to carry this realism to the utmost, Anselm proceeded in his Proslogion, circa 1074, to his famous ontological proof of the existence of God. God is the most perfect being that we can conceive. But if he were merely an idea in our heads, he would lack one element of perfection, namely existence. Therefore God, the most perfect being, exists. A modest monk, Gaunilo, signing himself Incipiens, or fool, wrote to Anselm, protesting that we cannot pass so magically from conception to existence, and that an equally valid argument would prove the existence of a perfect island, and Thomas Aquinas agreed with Gaunilo. In another brilliant but unconvincing tract, Cur Deus Homo, Anselm sought some rational ground for the fundamental Christian belief that God had become man. Why was this incarnation necessary? An opinion defended by Ambrose, Pope Leo I, and several fathers of the Church held that by eating the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve had sold themselves and all their progeny to the devil, and that only the death of God, become man, could ransom humanity from Satan and hell. Anselm proposed a subtler argument. The disobedience of our first parents was an infinite offense, because it sinned against an infinite being, and disturbed the moral order of the world. Only an infinite atonement could balance and wipe out that infinite offense. Only an infinite being could offer such infinite atonement. God became man to restore the moral balance of the world. The realism of Anselm was developed by one of Rosselin's pupils, William of Champeaux, from possibly 1070 to 1121. In 1103, William began to teach dialectics in the cathedral school of Notre Dame at Paris. If we may believe Abelard, who was too good a warrior to be a good historian, William out-Platoed Plato and held not only that universals are objectively real, but that the individual is an incidental modification of the generic reality, and exists solely by participating in the universal. So humanity is the real being which enters into and thereby gives existence to Socrates. Moreover, William is reported to have taught, the whole universal is present in every individual of its class. All humanity is in Socrates, in Alexander. To William's school Abelard came after much scholarly wandering, possibly in 1103, aged 24 or 25. He had a fine figure, a proud carriage, good looks, an imposing breadth of brow, and the vivacity of his spirit gave life and charm to his manners and speech. He could compose songs and sing them. His lusty humor shook the cobwebs in the dialectical halls. He was a gay and joyous youth who had discovered at the same time Paris and philosophy. His defects were those of his qualities. He was conceited, boastful, insolent, self-centered, and in the exhilaration of his conscious talent he rode with young thoughtlessness over the dogmas and sensibilities of his masters and his time. He was drunk with the dear delight of philosophy. This famous lover loved dialectic more than he loved Heloise. He was amused by the exaggerated realism of his teacher, and challenged him in open class. All humanity present in Socrates? Then, when all humanity is in Alexander, Socrates, included in all humanity, must be present in Alexander. Presumably William had meant that all the essential elements of humanity are present in each human being. We have not received William's side of the argument. In any case, Abelard would have none of it. To William's realism and to Rosselin's nominalism, he opposed what came to be called conceptualism. The class, man, stone, physically exists only in the form of its constituent members, men, stones. Qualities, whiteness, goodness, truth, exist only in the objects, actions, or ideas that they qualify. But the class and the quality are not mere names. They are concepts formed by our minds from elements or features observed to be common to a group of individuals, objects, actions, or ideas. These common elements are real, though they appear only in individual forms. The concepts by which we think of these common elements, the generic or universal ideas by which we think of classes of like objects, are not winds of voice, but the most useful and indispensable instruments of thought. Without them, science and philosophy would be impossible. Abelard remained with William, he tells us, for some time. Then he himself began to teach, first at Melun, later at Corbeil, the one 40, the other 25 miles from Paris. Some criticized him for setting up his own shop after too brief an apprenticeship, but a goodly number of students followed him, relishing his quick mind and tongue. Meanwhile, William became a monk at St. Victor, and by request continued his lectures there. To him, after a grievous illness, Abelard returned as a pupil. Apparently there was more meat on the bones of William's philosophy than a hasty reading of Abelard's brief autobiography suggests. But soon their old debates were resumed. Abelard, in Abelard's report, forced William to modify his realism, and William's prestige waned. His successor and appointee at Notre Dame, now, in possibly 1109, offered to yield his place to Abelard. William refused consent. Abelard resumed lecturing at Melun, then on Mont Sainte-Geneviève, just outside Paris. Between him and William, and between their students, a war of logic ran its wordy course for years. And Abelard, despite his rejection of nominalism, became the leader and hero of the moderni, the ardent young rebels of the modern school. While he was so embattled, his father and mother entered religious orders, presumably as a viaticum, and Abelard had to return to Le Palais to bid them Godspeed and perhaps to settle some problems of property. In 1115, after a term of studying theology at Laon, Abelard returned to Paris and, apparently without opposition, established his school or lecture course in those very cloisters of Notre Dame where he had squatted as a student some 12 years before. He became a canon of the cathedral, though not yet a priest, and might look forward to ecclesiastical dignities if he could hold his tongue. But it was a hard condition. He had studied literature as well as philosophy, and was a master of lucid and graceful exposition. Like any Frenchman, he acknowledged a moral obligation to be clear, and he was not afraid to let some humor lighten the burden of his speech. Students came from a dozen countries to hear him. His classes were so large that they brought him considerable money, as well as international fame. A letter written to him a few years later by Abbé Fulk bears witness. Rome sent you her children to instruct. Neither distance nor mountains nor valleys nor roads infested with brigands prevented the youth of the world from coming to you. Young Englishmen crowded to your classes across a dangerous sea. All quarters of Spain, Flanders, Germany sent you pupils, and they were never tired of praising the power of your mind. I say nothing of all the inhabitants of Paris and the most distant parts of France, which are also thirsty for your teaching, almost as if no science existed which could not be learned from you. From that height and splendor of success and renown, why should not he move on to a bishopric, as William had done, then to an archbishopric? Why not to the papacy? 2. Heloise. Up to this time, possibly around 1117, he doth protest he had maintained the most continence, and had diligently refrained from all excesses. But in the maiden Heloise, niece of the cathedral canon Fulbert, there was a comeliness of person, and a flair for learning which aroused the sensitivity of his manhood and the admiration of his mind. During those hectic years when Abelard and William fought the Universal War, Heloise had grown from infancy to girlhood as an orphan of whose parentage no certain trace remains. Her uncle sent her for many years to a convent at Argenteuil. There, falling in love with the books in the little library, she became the brightest pupil the nuns had ever had. When Fulbert learned that she could converse in Latin as readily as in French, and was even studying Hebrew, he took new pride in her and brought her to live with him in his home near the cathedral. She was 16 when Abelard came into her life in 1117. Presumably she had heard of him long since. She must have seen the hundreds of students who crowded the cloisters and lecture rooms to hear him. Perhaps, so intellectually eager, she had gone openly or furtively to see and hear the idol and paragon of the scholars of Paris. We can imagine her modest trepidation when Fulbert told her that Abelard was to live with them and be her tutor. The philosopher himself gives the frankest explanation of how it had come about. "It was this young girl whom I determined to unite with myself in the bonds of love, and indeed the thing seemed to me very easy to be done. So distinguished was my name, and I possessed such advantages of youth and comeliness, that no matter what woman I might favor with my love, I dreaded rejection of none. Thus, utterly aflame with passion for this maiden, I sought to discover means whereby I might have daily and familiar speech with her, thereby the more easily to win her consent. For this purpose I persuaded the girl's uncle to take me into his household in return for the payment of a small sum. He was a man keen in avarice, and believed that his niece would vastly benefit from my teaching. The man's simplicity was nothing short of astounding. I should not have been more surprised if he had entrusted a tender lamb to the care of a ravenous wolf. Why should I say more? We were united, first in the dwelling that sheltered our love, and then in the hearts that burned within us. Under the pretext of study, we spent our hours in the happiness of love. Our kisses outnumbered our reasoned words. Our hands sought less the book than each other's bosoms. Love drew our eyes together." What had begun with his simple physical desire graduated through Heloise's delicacy into a tenderness surpassing in sweetness the most fragrant balm. It was a new experience for him, and wooed him quite from philosophy. He borrowed passion from his lectures for his love, and left them anomalously dull. His students mourned the dialectician, but welcomed the lover. They were delighted to learn that even Socrates could sin. They consoled themselves for lost jousts of argument by singing the love songs that he now composed, and Heloise from her windows could hear on their lips the boisterous echo of his enchantment. Not long afterward she announced to him that she was with child. Secretly, by night, he stole her from her uncle's house and sent her to his sister's home in Brittany. Half from fear and half from pity, he offered to the infuriated uncle to marry Heloise, provided Fulbert would let him keep the marriage secret. The canon agreed, and after his classes had adjourned, Abelard went to Brittany to fetch a tender but unwilling bride. Their son, Astrolabe, was 3 days old when he arrived. Heloise long refused to marry him. The reforms of Leo IX and Gregory VII, a generation back, had barred married men from the priesthood unless the wife became a nun. She was not ready to contemplate such a surrender of her mate and her child. She proposed to remain his mistress on the ground that such a relationship, kept judiciously secret, would not, like marriage, close his road to advancement in the Church. A long passage in Abelard's History of My Calamities ascribes to Heloise at this point a learned array of authorities and instances against the marriage of philosophers, and an eloquent plea against robbing the Church of so shining a light. Remember that Socrates was wedded, and with how sordid a case he first purged that stain on philosophy, that thereafter other men might be more prudent. It would be far sweeter for her, he reports her as saying, to be called my mistress than to be known as my wife. Nay, this would be more honorable for me as well. He persuaded her by promising that the marriage would be known only to an intimate few. They left Astrolabe with the sister, returned to Paris, and were married in the presence of Fulbert. This book is continued on Cassette 8, Side 1.